feel like most of the productive discussion that we can have about this topic are in small groups. So the subject of our discussion tonight is dual power. And this is something that has been brought into the discussion by half a dozen speakers already. I know most people here have some familiarity with what we're talking about, but I just want to kind of treat this as a space to get on the same page about the core framework that we're working with for revolutionary struggle and revolutionary transitions of power, and get some clarity for how those of us in the social ecology tradition think of dual power, because there are some looser, some more restrictive senses of the meaning of that. And then, just to ground us in some particularity, I'm going to give a Cliff Notes overview of what I think that would look like in the city of Detroit. And this is something that, Rosie and I and Taj and other comrades here have been kind of thinking through and sketching out over the last several years. And there's lots of things that are unique about this city, but I think kind of getting into those details will help us think about what this can look like concretely in other contexts too. So the term dual power is something that comes to us from the Russian Revolution, and so in February of 1917, the women of Petrograd come out into the street. None of the revolutionary parties are involved, but they kick things off anyway, unleash a revolutionary situation, overthrow the Tsar in a couple of days. All of a sudden, the country is in chaos. No one knows who's in charge, and all across Petrograd and much of the rest of the city, much of the rest of the country, regular workers and soldiers get together in little meetings in their workplaces, in their neighborhoods, in their barracks, and basically form the kinds of little face-to-face democracies that we've been talking about all week. And then to try to make sure that the movement had coherence, had a vision together, to try to not let the revolution be reversed, but instead push forward, they all start sending a delegate to a citywide assembly. And this is the system that is known as the Soviets. That's just Russian for councils. And this was a system of self-rule in a context where political power was contested. And I think, if you really kind of sink your mind into what we mean by real political power, not simply like formal positions of authority, I think there's a clear case to be made that it was these institutions of the people, self-organized, that held real power at this time. And so, at the same time, those in the upper echelons of, the opposition to the Tsarist government, talking about people in previously toothless elected offices, themselves came together and said, we need to form a government that can steer the country in this moment of uncertainty. And so in these first months of revolutionary Russia, in a situation where there's one government that is officially in charge, the provisional government, seeing its job as guiding the country until they could have, elections to create a new constitution. And then you had this second government composed of the whole people, engaged in face-to-face democratic deliberation and federated decision-making. And so the reason why this is referred to as a dual power is there being two powers that are in contesting with one another for authority over society. And so when later revolutionary movements kind of look to this history to think through what are our pathways to a democratization of society, what they're thinking is we need to develop institutions of popular self-management, self-governance, collective action that not only can resist the state or protest the state or do our own thing on the side, but that can actually lay a claim to political legitimacy. To say, no, we actually, our institutions represent the interests of society to a far greater extent than the state can. I just want to make clear that I think of dual power as a strategic framework. It is not something that is inherently positive, inherently emancipatory, inherently left-wing. There are many examples throughout political history of highly effective reactionary dual powers. Some of the most effective dual power movements in the modern era, I would argue, are right-wing. Hezbollah or other Islamist movements in the Middle East are probably the most obvious examples, but far from the only ones. And so I would just make the case that for all social revolutions that have happened in the modern era, when there are states to confront, they have taken a dual power character for some period. And I think dual power has become sort of a political buzzword on the radical left for the last 5-6 years, and I think there's a lot of enthusiasm around developing alternatives for self-management, for providing for ourselves, cooperatives, et cetera, and kind of label all those things together as dual power. I think we need to have a little more clarity about how we're conceiving of the sort of counter-hegemonies that we're trying to build in society. And so I think what Emily was talking about the other night in terms of the solidarity economy, about imaginal cells in the caterpillar, that's kind of what people are thinking of in that more expansive sense of dual power, that we're creating little pieces of the new world here in the old, and those will develop, come together into something that can transform the whole thing. And when I say I want to bring a little more rigor or clarity to that conversation, I just think we should be upfront with ourselves and with our movement that the little pieces of that we're building are constituent elements of a potential future dual power, but they are not in themselves a dual power. There's not a dual power situation in the United States. We do not have, territorial sovereignty or autonomy or the ability to contest the state over control of society, except in particular, temporally and geographically limited moments. We can think of various kind of like temporary autonomous zones, like Capitol Hill and in Minneapolis during the uprisings in 2020. And so these are kind of like glimmers of the spaces that we can be expanding. But I think instead we should be using dual power as a framework for conceptualizing how the pieces of the new world that we're creating fit into a broader strategy of revolutionary transition? Are the cooperatives or neighborhood assemblies that we're building, are they capable of being constituent elements of a new organ of democratic self-governance that can challenge the state? And that at the end of the day is the heart of dual power, is the ability of our institutions to challenge the state, to displace it from its present supremacy over society. For social ecologists, people in social ecology world, the emphasis or the focus of dual power is primarily on neighborhood assemblies. Other traditions have focused on, for example, labor organizations. Syndicalism is a dual power oriented revolutionary labor movement. Folks thinking of the revolutionary union as the core institution of that dual power. That's kind of part of the history of the Russian Revolution, of the Spanish Civil War. That was the places of dual power in each of those. Personally, I tend to be whatever sticks to the wall, let's roll with it. And I think most revolutionary movements have been kind of mixed in terms of the kinds of popular institutions that have been able to mobilize the people and exercise real self-determination over their spaces. And so I think kind of the first step for thinking this through is doing deep studies of our own social landscapes, get a sense of the kinds of existing institutions in the community level that that have some potential for being spaces for democratic self-rule. And I think the question when thinking about things like neighborhood associations or other kinds of Rosewater and I were talking before about hyperlocal planning bodies in DC and LA. I think the question that we need to approach these with is, are these the kinds of institutions that we want to approach with an inside strategy, meaning they are currently composed in such a way that we can enter them, organize within them, democratize them, turn them into participatory bodies? Or are they the kind of institutions where we need to pursue with an outside strategy of this is not an entity that its internal logic allows us to change, and we need to organize institutions outside of them to challenge and displace them. I tend to think of organizations like block clubs in Detroit, which will be the main focus of the rest of the talk about. In the former category, things like homeowners associations and city council seats, et cetera, in the latter category. But the devil in all these things is in the details, and I think it really needs to draw upon some deep and focused study of our own context. So for the city of Detroit, I personally believe that the main organ of this kind of movement building work is the institution that we call here block clubs. Other cities have very similar things called block associations, et cetera. They are all hyper-local organizations of neighbors. Anyone who lives in a given place can join them, participate in them, and they do a whole variety of different things. Most are pretty apolitical, focus on things of like quality of life, doing neighborhood cleanups, boarding up abandoned houses, doing safety patrols, things of that nature. Others are involved in some kind of confrontational politics with developers or the city government on a variety of different things. But I think the kind of key characteristic of them is that any person who lives in a given community can participate. Most existing block clubs in Detroit are internally not particularly participatory. They're not demographically representative. The overwhelmingly dominant participants in block clubs in the city are church ladies over the age of 65. They're very much like a long time like black women's institution in Detroit, and a lot of the ones I'm involved with have really struggled to engage young people. They're also model kind of top-down nonprofit structures generally, with the offices being president, vice president, secretary, treasurer. But none of these things are written in stone, and in fact, the relatively low participation in block clubs, generally speaking, I think actually makes them quite readily changeable in terms of basic structure. And so, like in the block club work that Katie and Ray and I have been involved in, I think people who participate in these kind of see the default model as that's just what's on the table, it's what you do. But you can have conversations with people and make the case that, hey, if we want this to work, we need to have more of our neighbors actually showing up, and we need to make the formats of our meetings engaging, participatory, doing things like translation and childcare. These are all eminently possible, and so some of our work has been building block clubs that are participatory and democratic, and aiming for what I would call a mass character. The thing that makes these sorts of politically neutral spaces, I think, potentially have a democratic revolutionary possibility that explicitly ideological organizations do not, is precisely that the ability for any person, regardless of their political values, to enter into them and have their voice shape what that entity does, means that they have a claim to democratic legitimacy that our ideologically specific organizations simply can't. And so a lot of the work that's kind of gone into this organizing is literally just knocking on people's doors, saying, "Hey, we have this institution, we have this project going in our neighborhood. Here's the things we're working on. What do you want to be doing with get together with your neighbors and work on or fix together." The second kind of piece of this has been building relationships with other block clubs, and so we're part of a body on kind of like the central part of the West Side, called the West Side Community Coalition, which is composed of I think 7 or 8 different block clubs or clusters of block clubs in the neighborhood to make decisions as a whole body. And each one sends one person to this, and I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of making those more expansively democratic in a lot of the ways that we were talking about last night. But it's kind of the basic architecture. And so I think the core of the work towards building towards a dual power in the city of Detroit entails 3 main things roughly in succession. The first of those is organizing within to expand and democratize block clubs. Number of neighborhoods, they don't already exist, but they're actually pretty easy to start. And we have a cultural context where basically everyone knows about them, even if they're not active in one. And if you you go knock on a neighbor's door and say, "Hey, do you want to start a block club?" You're going to get surprisingly positive responses a lot of the time. So kind of internally democratizing these spaces so that they're thoroughly participatory. I think is the first part of that. I think the second is then the project of federation. And a number of block clubs talk to each other in different ways, but we don't have anything resembling a citywide institution of coordinating their activities across neighborhoods or even within neighborhoods. There are kind of like neighborhood-wide associations or federations of block clubs that exist in patches around the city. That's kind of the building blocks towards what I'm talking about. And then I think the third is to, once we've built that out, is to agitate within that democratic space. So what we're really creating is an insurgent public sphere, a new space for people to engage in politics, of making decisions with their community about what we're going to do. And the background political mentality of a lot of the city is, and I don't mean this pejoratively, is liberalism. We have elected officials. We want to hold them accountable. We organize to hold them accountable. And I think that's kind of the political logic that the process of building organizations like this and of them tackling fights that they become capable of as they grow and develop is on the road to breaking us out of. And so when I say agitate within these, I mean organize efforts by revolutionaries who play important roles in building out this mass organization of the democratic federation of our neighborhoods, to push that assembled people to lay claim to more of their power, to take over and put to communal use abandoned property in their neighborhoods, to challenge the city more directly. And ultimately, when we're talking about pushing for revolutionary confrontations, with dual power, what we're talking about is dissolving the powers of the municipal government into that federation. And there are all kinds of historical triggers for how that's happened in the past, of how these kinds of institutions existing alongside the state have found themselves able to push it aside. I don't think we can predict what those are, but what we can do is organize the conditions for that seizure to be possible. And that's kind of one of my main lessons I draw from revolutionary history is nobody knows when this shit's going to go down. You can't plan it. You can't chart it out in advance and execute it. But you're never going to pull it off unless you've done the organizing in advance. And 95% of that is talking to other regular people, getting in a room, or just out on somebody's lawn and having a community conversation. And I think I've had a couple people come talk to me over the course of the week and just ask some version of the basic question: what do you think our movement should be doing more of that we're not doing? And my answer to that is always, you should be knocking on your neighbors' doors and getting together with folks in your community who are not necessarily our political fellow travelers, but with whom we're going to build the institutions that can make anything we believe in happen. It's not going to be us in this room who topple the state. Never will be, never has been. But with those kind of relationships and that kind of organized power, anything's possible. So I'm going to wrap up there. And as far as prompts for small groups, I would say go in a totally different direction if your group wants to, but something that I would like to ask those of you, especially if folks have not gotten a chance to talk about your local organizing much with this week, is what kind of community activities or institutions, what exists in your own social landscape that might be building blocks of a future dual power in your city. And I think that's a good framing for a bit of a go around, and we can see where discussion goes from there. Does that sound good?